Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 112. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Boston. Find out where to go in Beantown and why sometimes the phrase, as slow as molasses in January, isn't appropriate.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh no, 15-hour flight, oh, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I have just one news story for you today, and that's an interesting one. According to a study by Forrester Research, who is one of the leading technology consulting firms in the U.S., 9% fewer people booked travel online this year than did in 2005. While all other online e-commerce markets are growing, the travel online industry seems to be shrinking. Not exactly sure why. The people who are buying online are buying more, but fewer people are doing it. Although this makes some sense with other studies I've seen that say the use of travel agents is actually on the rise again. It's probably just our busy schedules, but I'd be curious to hear why you think this may be the case. I'd like to welcome to the show Adam Weiss. Adam is here to talk about Boston, and Adam is the host of the Boston Behind the Scenes podcast. Grid Skipper recently said about your show, every city should have a podcast like the Boston Behind the Scenes. What a really nice promo for you, and welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be on.
So, Adam, you actually do two podcasts about Boston, I believe.
Yeah, I do one that is specifically about Boston, the Boston Behind the Scenes show, which is at bostonbehindthescenes.com if people want to find it. But I also do the podcast for the Museum of Science here in Boston, and that's a science news show that is somewhat Boston-focused, but more national and international in that we get researchers and news from all over the place. With all of the research that goes on in this area, we have a lot of people to draw from all the universities and the labs to talk a lot about Boston science as well as science everywhere else.
That's great. Now, I was thrilled to finally get around to doing a show about Boston because Boston is actually one of my favorite towns, but even more thrilled to be able to do it with somebody who knows a little better than I do. You live there, although you haven't lived there your whole life. If you had a friend who came to Boston for a week, what would you spend your time doing?
Well, I had to check and make sure the city was still here this morning after the World Series last night. But
oh, congratulations, yes.
Thanks. I'm actually really glad that the Sox won away, and a lot of people wouldn't agree with me on that, but I don't want an extra 40,000 people in Kenmore Square running around like crazy people because there were already tens of thousands at the bars over there. So it's really good to have them win. It was a good series to watch, but I'm glad that for the sake of the city that it was an away game where they won. Obviously, right there, sports is a really, really big part of Boston, and people here are crazy about it. I'm not much of a sports fan. I never really watched very many sports before I came here, but I watched the last 8 baseball games, all of them, because nobody at work would listen to me or talk to me. Yeah, absolutely. So Fenway Park, you can go and see that. There are tours all year round, and the tour is pretty good. I've taken it, and even when there's not a lot going on baseball-wise, they take you out in the field. You get to walk on the field. You get to walk up to the big green scoreboard on the Green Monster, see some really famous stuff, see the seat where Ted Williams hit his record-breaking long home run into the back of the stadium. And it's really fun to do that, and it's in the Kenmore Square area of Boston with a lot of other things. It's near BU, and there's
Boston
a lot of
University.
stuff. Yeah, Boston University, yeah. We have Boston University and Boston College, and they're on two different subway lines way out kind of on the ends of the city. But BC is actually not in Boston. Boston
They're on
College.
the Green Line, as I recall.
Yes, they're both on the Green Line. Boston University is in Boston, and Boston College is not. That's way out there.
That's out by Newton.
Yes, it's the Heartbreak Hill part of the Boston Marathon. All the BC students are there cheering the people on as they run up the hill. But I'm kind of throwing a bunch of stuff in there without answering your question. The things that you have to see in Boston, like when you first get here, probably the best thing to do is go to the Visitor Center on Boston Common and grab yourself a map of the Freedom Trail and walk the Freedom Trail. It takes a few hours. You could do it as a whole day thing if you want, because there's a lot of stuff along the way. That'll get you to the Old North Church and Paul Revere's house and the Old South Meeting House. And it'll get you to some of the cemeteries where very famous Americans are buried. There's actually a pub across the street from one of the cemeteries that has a sign on the wall that says, "This is the only place where you can drink a Sam Adams while looking at his grave," which I think is amusing.
Is that the Granary?
Yes, the Granary Cemetery is where Sam Adams is buried, and also the victims of the Boston Massacre.
Right.
And that's right near Government Center Plaza, where we have our city hall. You can see a lot of stuff on the Freedom Trail, and the trail itself obviously is free to walk, and a lot of the stuff on there is the standard tourist stuff, and it's not that expensive to do. There are things that you can buy a ticket that'll get you into a bunch of different places for a discount. So maybe pick up one of these City Pass things or some of the other things, because it can get you a little bit cheaper into stuff.
Okay. I would definitely also recommend taking your National Park passport, as a lot of those are national parks along the Freedom Trail there.
Yes. You don't really think of that when you're in downtown Boston, but because pretty much all of American history happened here up to a point, we do have...
I'm sure there's a few Virginians that would object to that, but yes, there was quite a lot that happened there.
Yes. I mean, definitely. But from where I am sitting right now in my apartment, if I had a nicer apartment and windows that looked out on things, I could see the Old North Church from here. I could see Paul Revere's house from here. I could see the USS Constitution from here. And those are all within a 3-minute walk of where I am. So there's all sorts of stuff to see. And all of those things are on the Freedom Trail as well.
As we talk about the Freedom Trail, do you have any part of that that is your favorite?
You know, to be honest, I've never walked the whole thing at once. I've probably been to everything along it more than once, but I've never gone from one end to the other, partly because I live in the middle of it. And
Sure.
I feel it's a little silly to walk through my neighborhood as a tourist, and I try to avoid it because everybody in my neighborhood is tourists anyway. By the way, I live in the north end of Boston, which is where all the Italian restaurants are and where the Old North Church and the Paul Revere House, those kind of things are. The north end is a very different part of Boston from the rest of the city. It was actually separated from Boston for about 50 years by the highway that ran through the middle of the city, and that's the big dig project everybody's heard about, was tearing down that highway and putting it underground. So the north end is pretty cool because it hasn't had the opportunity as much as some of the rest of the downtown area, because it's right next to downtown, to kind of be modernized in terms of the way it looks and in terms of what's there. We don't have big skyscrapers here. The tallest building in the north end is probably 6 or 7 stories tall, and they're all old tenement buildings from more than 100 years ago. And it's a really fun neighborhood that is one of the only real neighborhoods still where people spend a lot of time. A lot of people that grew up in the neighborhood spend a lot of time just sitting outside and saying hi to people. Everybody's friends with the policemen and the firemen and everybody else in the neighborhood. So it's really kind of fun to come here. And also you can get really great food. I think there are, I'm going to get this number wrong because it changes all the time, but there's something like 75 restaurants in the 1/4 square mile of the north end. So
most Italian.
Yeah. We do have one Chinese place.
Okay.
Everybody has a Chinese place somewhere, right? And we have a couple Mediterranean food places and some other stuff, but it's pretty much Italian food, and that's pretty much who lives here. I mean, the sign at the bank teller says, "I speak Italian" as well. You have people here that don't speak English and that have lived here their entire lives, that are 80 years old, and they don't speak very much English. The woman that runs the laundromat that sometimes I take my clothes to, She's really great. She can be a bit abrasive sometimes, like some people can be, but she's great because she really tries to speak to you, but kind of forgets that half of what she says in Italian and half of what she says in English. So it's always an interesting experience trying to understand what she's telling you about the washing machine. But there's some really great characters here in the North End. They're great characters everywhere in Boston. But I'd say spend some time in the North End. It's a great place to get some food. There's a lot of the history stuff right here.
And as long as we're talking food in the North End, favorite restaurant?
Favorite restaurant? I'm not going to say, especially because I live here, but there's all sorts of good stuff. What I would say is that if you come here on maybe a Friday night or Saturday night, one of the really busy times, Hanover Street is where everybody goes, but there are some really good places on Salem Street, which runs parallel to Hanover Street, just one block over, and it's a lot less busy. Hanover Street is the only two-way street in the North End. Everything else is one way.
That's right.
For that reason, that's where all the big restaurants, or a lot of the big restaurants are, because the cabs can come in and out, and the valets can park the cars, and those kind of things. There are a lot of good restaurants on other streets in the North End, and I have not been to a place in the North End where I thought, this food just isn't very good. Some of the food is a little better than other food, and some of the food is really amazing, but I've never been to a place where the food was bad. So just go somewhere, and don't necessarily feel like you have to wait in line for 3 hours. There's one place that people wait hours and hours and hours for. And it's a little place where there's no room and they rush you through your meal and the food is good, but maybe just go somewhere else and find something if it's really busy. There's all sorts of cool places around here.
We've talked about the Green Line and we've talked about one-way streets. How would you recommend people get around Boston?
Don't drive.
Thank you.
If you want a funny spot, you can go in the South End area to the intersection of Tremont Street and Tremont Street, and they're the same street. It's not like two streets with the same name. This street doubles back on itself. And this is one of the few intersections that actually has a road sign, so you can see this intersection as a little bit of a tourist attraction. But most of our streets do not have road signs. A lot of the streets are one way. None of the streets are straight. There are plenty of other confusing ones. Tremont and Tremont is bad enough as the same street, but I used to live in Cambridge, and I lived right next to the intersection of Appleton Street and Appleton Road. There are all sorts of really bad, confusing things about driving. People say that the Boston drivers are terrible, and I'm not going to dispute that they're bad drivers and that they're very aggressive and go through red lights and do stupid things. But it's worse than that in terms of, as a driver here that's not familiar with the city, it's not necessarily the other people that are driving that you have to worry about. It's really the roads. It's the fact that you cannot find anything or get anywhere in a car. And really, a car is not going to save you time.
Right.
In living here for 5 years, I will say that it takes about the same amount of time, as long as you're going less than 2 miles, to drive, walk, or take the subway. They all take exactly the same amount of time because the subway system is pretty good, but it doesn't go everywhere. And if you think about New York City, you can get to many, many points, like in Manhattan, very easily on the subway system because it's a real network of trains underground. But our subway system is more of spokes on a wheel. So you have to come into the middle and go back out to get from one place to another sometimes, and that can slow you down. So if you're up to it and the weather's nice, walk. It's a small city. You can walk from the North End, which is right on the water, to Fenway Park in about an hour and 15 minutes. And that's through the main part of the city that most people visit. So it's not that big.
The other thing that I want to add, somebody on our discussion boards, I said you were coming and did they have any questions? And they wanted to know why Boston drivers don't know how to merge, but which I think is a little unfair. Quite often, and it's the only place I've seen this in the U.S., at the end of the entrance ramp onto the freeway, there's actually a stop sign. So you actually have to merge onto the freeway from a full stop. So yet another reason I would say not to drive in Boston, because especially public transportation there is so good.
Yeah. I mean, I live here, so I have problems with the T because I try to take it all the time, and I always get on it when the trains aren't working or whatever. But yeah, our public transportation system is very good, especially compared to some cities. We have a good subway system. We have a bus system that will get you places, but they don't always run on time, and it's not very expensive. We're all complaining because they've raised the fares. So you can get many, many, many miles for $1.70 if you get the right card. Actually, if you're going to come and ride the T, I will recommend this. Get one of our plastic Charlie cards, which is an RFID tag card for storing money on. It's the contactless reader ones. You can get them for free, but you have to kind of beg for them. Like ask one of the T employees or go into one of the stores that has a Charlie card logo on their window, because that will get you a much cheaper fare on the T.
Good tip. Okay.
Normally, the T costs $2. If you get on a Green Line train and you stick your money in the machine, it'll take you $2, and then it'll make you pay again if you want to switch to a bus or if you want to get off and get back on really quickly or something like that. If you get one of the plastic cards, not the paper ones. The paper ones are basically the same as cash. They're just more convenient. But get one of the plastic cards. you can switch from the train to the bus or the bus to the train without paying extra or very much extra at all. So it's worth it to seek one out, and you can get them for free if you find the right person.
Okay. The only thing I can think about that's negative in the T is the old song about the person who spent the rest of his life riding the MTA because they'd raised the rates. But
that's where our Charlie card name came from. That's why
that's
the
Charlie.
cards are named Charlie
right.
Cards, because it's Charlie on the MTA. Kingston Trio. It's a good song.
Exactly.
Go find it.
All right. So what else would we see in Boston?
One thing that nobody ever sees, right downtown, kind of in the downtown crossing shopping area, near downtown crossing State Street. It's right near the Old South Meeting House.
Okay.
There's a little alleyway. I think it's called Spring Alley. It's Spring something. I don't know what the name of it is. And the reason it's called Spring Alley is there's a plaque on the wall about halfway down on the left-hand side that said this is the location of the Boston Spring, where the early colonists got their water for years. That place is the reason that Boston exists here, because there was a spring. This was all swamp and brackish water and mosquitoes and everything else when they got here, and they needed to be able to drink something, and everything was salt water except for that spring. It's just a little plaque on a wall down this alley right in the middle of the city, but you can read that and stand on the spot that basically gave Boston life for years, and that's the reason why the people settled here at all.
Interesting.
The Christian Science Mother Church is a really impressive building. The Christian Science Monitor building is here as well. And in that complex, they have this globe that you can stand inside of. That's a stained glass globe of the world that is, I think it's about 20 feet in diameter, something like that. And it's just a really cool thing to see. There's some great architecture over there. That's near the Prudential Center Mall and Symphony Hall. There's a lot of stuff over in that area. The parks, landscape architecture as a field, one of the big places it started was here in Boston with Olmsted, and he designed the whole greenway system, our Emerald Necklace, as they call it, which kind of starts at Boston Common and is a pretty much unbroken line of parks through the entire city down to Jamaica Pond. And you could start on Boston Common and walk with just having to cross a bunch of streets. You could walk in the grass for, I think, 14 miles to get to Jamaica Pond. It's about 14 miles. There are a lot of great parks here. And now they've just taken that and augmented it. After the big dig, they're not quite done yet, but they've put most of the stuff underground. And what they've done with where this ugly 100-foot tall superhighway was, they've put in parks everywhere. That was one of the stipulations of the big dig, that everything that was the road had to become a park. And now you have these areas where I can walk out my door, go a few minutes, and walk in a park from where I am to the New England Aquarium, past there down to South Station, which is a neat old train station. Our North Station is gone, along with the Boston Garden, but the South Station is our kind of old classic train station, which you can still see. And there are lots of things that you can walk up and down in parks, and just lots of little green places everywhere.
Now, obviously, the Common wasn't originally built as a park per se, but has certainly been one for many, many years.
Yeah, Boston Common was originally an area for grazing your cattle, and it was an area that anybody could use, and it still is like
Hence
that.
The name.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a lot of cattle there, though, recently.
No, I don't think they allow you to graze cattle any longer, but if you go to Boston Common, you'll see some things you won't see in some other cities. People will have big protests and big gatherings, and you don't need as many permits to do it there as you do in other places. And there are lots of people that are out there handing out pamphlets and setting up tents to talk about whatever it is that they're interested in, whether it's their religion or whether it's a political issue or anything else. And it really is an area where free speech is encouraged.
Okay.
And there are people there all the time. There are guys out there literally on soapboxes out there calling off to people and trying to get people's attention about something. I really like that area for that reason, that there's just a lot of people there always, and they're not going to yell at you for sleeping in the grass. They're not going to kick you out of the park at night unless you're doing something really obnoxious. It's unusual as a big central city park to have so much stuff going on there that's really not monitored or bothered a whole lot.
Okay.
And it's right next to the public gardens, which is the area where kind of the planned park system for Boston started. And that's actually the line that used to be shoreline, because most of the city is built on landfill.
Right.
And the public gardens was part of the shoreline. They filled that in and then turned it into parks and went on from there. All the back bay was water until they filled it in.
One question for you, and a question I usually ask our guests. If I go to Boston and I do my homework ahead of time and look at all the different places that the guidebooks tell me to go, what place that's recommended in the guidebooks do you think is really probably just a waste of time?
I'll kind of give a qualified answer to that one, because a lot of people go to Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market for food.
Sure.
And they go there
I've done that myself.
to do the tourist thing. There are a lot of interesting things there, but it's not the Urban Outfitters and the Brookstone and the stores that are there. There are some cool little stores there, but there's a lot of chain stores that you're going to find at any mall. And there's food, but most of it is
Food court.
food that you're
Yeah.
going to find at any mall. There are some cool restaurants. If you're a fan of the TV show Cheers, they have a replica of the Cheers set that you can eat in there. And the food is not bad. You know, it's not the best food ever, but, you know, the food is not bad. So there are some things to do there.
And there's still Durgan Park, for instance.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So there are some good things there. But I would say the real reason to go to Faneuil Hall is for the building itself that nobody goes into. People go into the shops in the basement of Faneuil Hall. People wander around Quincy Market and buy their knickknacks. But Faneuil Hall is one of the places that really started the American Revolution. I would say go into that building, go up the stairs, sit in the seats, listen to the Park Service spiel about what it is, and actually go up into the kind of the attic section of Faneuil Hall. There's a really cool museum of one of the oldest military orders in the country and one of the older ones in the world, not counting ones that are thousands of years old. And there are some really interesting things in there. So I'm not going to tell people not to go to Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market, but don't just go there to get French fries. There are lots of cool things there. There are world-class street performers that are there
that's true.
all the time. And watch them. They're going to do something that will amaze you. I interviewed one of them on my podcast, and he's done his act in Canada and in Australia and all over the U.S., and you have to work to be a street performer at Faneuil Hall. You have to go through a competition in order to be out there.
I'm curious who you interviewed.
Oh, his name is Jason Escape, and he's an escape artist who ties himself up in a straitjacket and then something like 100 feet of rope and then wriggles out of it, all while doing this act. So, you know, he's really good. He can dislocate all of his joints and do all these kind of weird things, but he's also a really good magician. He does a lot of other cool stuff, and there are all sorts of really cool street performers there. So watch the street performers, go into Faneuil Hall and learn about the history, and then grab your French fries. But people go there just to have a snack and to go to the Gap if it's still there or whatever, you know. But you can do that at the mall. Don't do that when you're in this area that really was an important part of Boston in the past and still is. One of the cool things about Faneuil Hall, the building, the actual hall inside where people can still go and give talks, is that if you want to hold an event that has a civic purpose, you just need to say, I would like to give a speech in Faneuil Hall on this topic, and you fill out your little form and you turn it in, and they say yes to pretty much everybody, no matter what it is.
Interesting.
Because that's what that place is for. It's kind of like Boston Common. It's a place that everybody is supposed to have access to do things that are for the betterment of the community, or that are at least in the community's interest. So people will go in there and give speeches on whatever, can look at the schedule and go in and do it. Sometimes it's closed as a result of that to just go in and look around. But that's one of the more interesting things there. The architecture, the buildings, the actual history there. And again, not the fast food joints inside Quincy Market.
Other places like that tourists miss. Walk right by.
Places that people walk right by. We have so many museums that are really cool little things in Boston. We have so many little things that are left over from the very beginnings of the city or from a couple hundred years ago. I mean, obviously, I work at the Science Museum, which is one of the biggest attractions in the city, and I will recommend people go there. It's really cool. But there are so many other museums beyond the Science Museum and the NFA and the aquarium, all of which are worth seeing, I think. But there are little places. There's the African Meeting House, which talks about some of the interesting early anti-slavery stuff that happened in Boston. You can go into Paul Revere's house. It's one of the oldest buildings in the city. It's in the North End, and you can wander around and see what life was like back then. That is something that a lot of people go and do because it's on the Freedom Trail. But it is interesting to go into, and a lot of people will just walk past it, have their picture taken in front of the wall, and not go in, mainly because it's busy. But, I mean, there are lots of little places like that. So I would say if you see some place that says it's some type of museum, you know, peek your head in and take a look. Sometimes they're free. Sometimes they're just a small fee. I'd also say go and look at some of the real Boston sections of the city that are left over from construction that happened 100, 200, 300 years ago. Maybe not 300 years ago at this point, but there are some really cool places just to walk down streets in the Back Bay. Marlborough Street is a really nice street in the Back Bay area. And it's these old mansions and brownstone houses that, you know, there aren't any shops there. There aren't any street vendors. It's just where people live. But it's a really, really pretty place to go and look around. And then also go outside of the places that are covered by the Freedom Trail and the places that are on your tourist map. Go into South Boston. Go into some of the South End areas. There's all sorts of cool stores and restaurants down in there. And Boston is more than just Boston. We say Boston, and we generally mean, and I don't mean to offend anybody else here, but you mean the Boston area with Cambridge and Somerville and all these other areas. Go into the other areas. Everybody goes to Harvard Square. Not as many people are going to go, for instance, to Davis Square, which is a really cool area with restaurants and a very different feel to it. That's farther out it's one of the last stops on the Red Line. So people don't think to go out there, but go check it out. Boston is the type of place where almost anywhere you go, there's something to do, at least something to see and something interesting history-wise, and stuff that you don't even think of to see. There's a park right on the waterfront in the North End, and there's a little plaque on the wall there. And this is a story some people might know or some people might not, but it's a plaque that commemorates where the largest molasses flood in the world happened.
All right.
There was
I was just wondering
the
other day, where was the largest molasses flood in the world?
There was a giant molasses storage tank that right around Prohibition time, they used molasses to make rum. And with the coming of Prohibition, there was all this molasses that was set to make rum that they couldn't use anymore. And it built up in the storage tank and built up and built up and built up. And the tank exploded. The interesting, and I mean, it's a sad story overall, but there is a bit of irony in that a giant wave of hot molasses moved through the city in January. So slow as molasses in January is not appropriate in this case. A lot of people, a number of people were killed. A lot of buildings were destroyed. It was millions of gallons of molasses. It took down the elevated train tracks in the area. And some people that live on that side of the North End still say that in a really hot summer midday, you can still smell molasses in the basement rooms. So, and right next to that plaque, there are bocce courts where in the summer, the old Italian guys are out there playing bocce every night, and they play it competitively. They've got their tape measures, and they've got their wine, they've got their other things, but they're out there playing for money in some cases, going back and forth and playing this game, which is really quite fun to watch, and they're really interesting people. So I would say go to some of the places where there are people doing what they do, and the Italian guys playing bocce, they don't mind if you sit and watch. So go down there sometime. It's right in the park across from the USS Constitution. There are other places that you can see those kinds of things, kind of right outside of the real tourist areas. Go and do all the stuff on Newbury Street, where everybody goes to shop and eat. Go just a few streets over, and you're on Marlborough Street and some of the other just cool, old, pretty streets that are in the Boston area that are just worth looking at, but nobody really seems to visit as a tourist because they're focused on Newbury Street and getting their designer clothing or fancy meals.
And what are your top 3 favorite day trips out of Boston?
If it's just a quick little trip, if you're someone that lives here or someone that's visiting and you're not renting a car, you're in the city, you're in here for a few days, and maybe you want to see some nature, you can take the Orange Line up to the end, Oak Grove Station, and go to the Middlesex Fells, which is a state park. And there's some really nice walking trails. You can take a mountain bike up there and walk around. And you can get to it. It's about an 8 or 9 minute walk from the Oak Grove T Station. You do need to maybe look up online or look up on a map how to get there from the Oak Grove T Station, because you have to kind of just walk through a little neighborhood and walk up a hill. But then you're in this state park with some of the reservoirs that feed the Boston area, its water, and some really nice tree-lined paths and other things to wander around. That can be a day trip, but it's a day trip you can get to in the T, which is really cool. I mean, I don't own a car. I would be crazy to own a car, I think, where I live. And therefore, if I want to go somewhere farther away, I rent one or take the more expensive public transportation. But I can just pull my Charlie card out and go for a walk in the woods by going up to the end of the Orange Line. So I would say the Middlesex Fells is a cool place. There's also the Stone Zoo up there that people like to go and see. We have 2 zoos in Boston. The zoo in Franklin Park is in the city, and then the Stone Zoo is up to the north in the Middlesex Fells area. Okay. Another day trip that I would really recommend people do, which you can do right from the city again, is the Boston Harbor Islands National Park. All the islands that are in the harbor that go out quite far, and you can get on a boat for not too much money right next to the New England Aquarium and head out to George's Island, which has an old fort on it. And then go from there on kind of a boat that runs between the islands. And you can actually go out there overnight and go camping, or you can go walking in all these areas. There's all sorts of trails. And there's some really, really good views of the city when you come back in and when you go out on the boat. So some people want to take a harbor cruise just to see the city, do the dinner cruise thing or whatever else. But for less money and an additional trip that you get in there, you can just take the boat that's fundamentally a ferry out to the islands and see the harbor islands, and then come back and you still get your cool pictures and views of the skyline coming back in. And then another one that is harder to do in terms of scheduling, because you need to get tickets ahead of time, and it does cost a little bit more, but you can go out to the Boston Light, which is one of the farther islands, and it's the oldest manned lighthouse in the country. And I think it's the second oldest lighthouse in the country. The only reason it's not the oldest lighthouse in the country is because the one that was there first was blown up by the British when they were retreating. And they rebuilt this one out of the pieces of the old one. But so there is one lighthouse that's older. But this one, there is a lighthouse keeper, actually a female lighthouse keeper. She's one of the first female lighthouse keepers that wasn't there because her husband died. It was the way it used to work. But she's there with her husband, who's just the lighthouse keeper's husband, and they're Coast Guard auxiliary people who are out there running the lighthouse. And actually, it's interesting that lighthouse is actually run on wind power. There's a number of big wind turbines you can see from the lighthouse, but they're in Hull, Massachusetts. There's a big wind turbine and a cable that runs under the water to power the lighthouse. So that's a really cool trip itself. I just did that for the first time in October. It was really interesting to get to go and see and actually hear from, in this case, the lighthouse keeper was away training, but from her husband about what it's like to live out there and what it takes to run a lighthouse. So you actually get to talk to people that do the job. And it's not a huge tourist thing. It's a small boat. We probably had 40 people come out there with us and wander around the island for a couple hours and go back in. And it's fun to get a chance to go out beyond the islands that you usually get to with the Standard Harbor Islands tour that way.
My family and I have done the Standard Harbor Islands tour, and one of the things I actually mentioned the National Park Passport. We discovered it because if you do get the National Park Passport, which has the 365 different parks, and I'm sure it's a growing number, then you find out these little parks that you just wouldn't know about, and that's how we discovered that, as well as, for instance, the JFK Birthplace Museum in Boston, which is just the house that he grew up in.
Obviously, JFK is a big part of Boston history more recently, and I would say going to the JFK Library and Museum, if you get a chance, is also a really good experience, and it's also another really cool place. I'm a photographer as well as other things I do, and I love the cool views of Boston, and it's a view of Boston you don't usually get from that library. It's worth going to for plenty of other reasons, but on top of that, it's a cool place because it's right under the Logan approach path for the airport. And the planes will actually come down almost to the level of the library when you're in there. And you can get, I've gotten some amazing pictures of the planes reflected in the windows of the library. So interesting views down there. Logan Airport, anybody who's ever flown into it knows that Logan Airport, you hit the land as soon as it's there, you fly in over water, and then the wheels touch something that you didn't even know was there. And that approach path comes over the JFK Library and over the harbor, and then right in onto the water, pretty much onto the land right there. That's an interesting place. If you're into airplanes, watch airplanes. If you're into cool views, you get some good stuff from down there. And if you're into history, there's a lot of good things in the museum, and it's a really interesting, impressive building as well.
Now, obviously, we can't cover all of Boston in one episode of The Amateur Traveler. We're starting to run out of time here. So certainly your podcast is something that people should check out if they're interested in more information. There's so much that we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about Lexington and Concord. We only briefly mentioned Old Ironsides. There's just many different things. Duck Tours, which is actually how you and I connected, was a reference on my website to the Duck Tours in Boston. If we had to hit just one more thing before we wrap this up, what would you say? What can't we leave Boston without talking about?
Like you said, there are so many different types of things. I would say maybe some of the non-museum, non-tourist attraction kind of public institutions. Certainly the Boston Symphony Orchestra is something that a lot of people watch on the 4th of July, and you see our fireworks display and hear the Boston Pops play.
I've done that.
So Symphony Hall is a really cool place to go, and it is a really good orchestra. So if you get a chance to see a concert, I would say do that. Also, they do free concerts in the summer sometimes at the Hatch Shell on the Esplanade, so one of the other parks in Boston along the Charles River. Things like the Boston Public Library, one of the oldest public libraries in the country. It's a really cool building to go in and see. If people have been to the New York Public Library, they have the cool building, but they have closed stacks for a lot of things. So you can't go and look through all the books as much as you can in the Boston Public Library. So you can go through and just look at all the cool old stuff. And if you're into libraries, actually, I'd finish up with one real kind of hidden one that I did a podcast on if you're interested in learning more. But the Boston Athenaeum is one of the oldest membership libraries in the country.
Interesting.
And they actually helped start the Boston Public Library. And they have some of John Adams' book collection. They have stuff from Monticello, from Jefferson. They have a lot of really cool historical books, and they always have a free exhibit going on the first floor of their library. So you can see some of the really interesting things. They have sculptures and paintings and books there, and that is right near the State House, which is another thing that you want to get a chance to see as well, right on Beacon Hill. The Boston Athenaeum is a place that everybody walks past. It's just a normal-looking building that happens to have some really fancy leather-covered doors, but it's worth a walk in there. It is free to go in and walk around on the first floor. And it's just an amazing building with a lot of history inside that nobody really gets a chance to see.
Excellent. Well, again, we've left so much uncovered because of time. Still one of my favorite cities. You mentioned the Pops. I've spent the 4th of July on the Esplanade with 300,000 of my closest friends, listening to both the Boston Pops as well as the National Guard playing the howitzer for the 1812 overture there. So
Don't sit right next to the
don't
cannons.
sit right next to the cannon. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on the show. We'll either have to have you come back sometime or maybe send us some video for the video edition. But Adam, thanks for coming on the show. I'll let you plug your podcast one more time.
All right, it was great to be on, and you can find out a lot more about Boston at bostonbehindthescenes.com.
Thanks very much.
Thanks to you, Chris.
I have one internet resource for you today, and that is OpenTable.com. If you haven't used OpenTable yet, OpenTable is a way to find an open table at a restaurant. OpenTable currently supports 8,000 restaurants. It doesn't support every city, certainly, but Boston is one of those cities, which is what made me think of it. If I go to Boston, for instance, and I try and find a table for two on November 1st at 7 o'clock in Boston's North End, I can find 20 different Italian restaurants that will give me a table at 7 o'clock and 3 other restaurants also. So it's certainly not every restaurant in the North End, but it's a very quick way to find who has space at a given time, and it'll also give you some links off to the restaurant information. It doesn't actually have menus itself, but will have a link to the restaurant's website if they have one. So check that out, opentable.com. I got a lovely letter from Leah this week who says, "Hi Chris, I just started listening to your podcast. I would love to travel. My whole life I had wanted to see it all. I watched National Geographic when I was young, then on to Discovery Channel and Travel Network. With the internet I can see nearly everything, and now with podcasting I can listen to your great show while I'm driving, etc. I just wanted to say thanks for the great show. I cannot afford to travel at this time. I could barely afford the iPod. I have 3 teenage kids. My 18-year-old son just moved to Hawaii 3 weeks ago, and that leaves my husband and me with 2 teenage girls. Can you say," lots of dollar signs, "I have only been on a cruise to the Bahamas. My husband won the trip, but your podcasts are really enjoyable to listen to. I'm so happy that I can see photos and read articles and watch videos, but it would be so wonderful to actually get to go to some of the places that I've dreamed of for so long. Maybe once my kids get older, my husband and I will be able to travel some. Until then, keep up the good work. Dreaming of all the wonderful places on the planet, Leah." One of the reasons that I want to do domestic places like Boston, in addition to exotic places like last week's show on Mongolia, is that it is someplace that is easier to get to for people. And so I want to cover some regional spots for people to go and travel to because they are more affordable, certainly. And I think they're also wonderful. Boston is really a big favorite of mine, especially as a big history buff that I am. I'll often get the question from people, do you travel that much, when they hear I have a travel show? And as I wrote back to Leah, I don't travel as much as I'd like to. If I did, I probably wouldn't have to podcast about travel. This is part of my outlet for my travel lust as well, so I know whereof you speak. After the usual closing of this show, I'm going to end with a promo for The Gamer Traveler. And Daniel Perez of The Gamer Traveler, you may remember, was on recently to talk about his trip to Netherlands and Belgium. With that, I'm trying to get this show out before I start traveling again. I am going on a cruise to the Panama Canal, leaving on Friday, so there won't be a new show coming out in a week. If I get time, I may look in the back catalog and put out a best of show. Just put out a show that I really liked that I don't think most of you have heard. But no promises for that because it really depends on how much time I get before I go. If you want to contact me, as Leah did, send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com or call the comment line, which is 408-8494-POD, or check out all the other ways to contact me in the contact page at amateurtraveler.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The Gamer Traveler podcast combines gaming and travel all in one. In each episode, we feature a location around the world, learn about its history and travel appeal, and then find ways to use it in your games. We also have sound scene tours and interviews with other gamer travelers. Learn more by visiting thegamertraveler.com, where you can see the show notes and post in the forums. The Gamer Traveler Podcast, because our world is the best campaign setting. thegamertraveler.com.
The best and the brightest, served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, Podshow and Limelight.